Welcome back, everybody, to the final session. So let's wake up! It's very hot.
It is.
Our brain cells have been gradually frying a little. So we're going to have a lot of energy for this final session, a lot of great ideas, and this is where we start. Now, writing in the Lancet in 2008, Keizo and Michael Reich talked about global action on health systems as they made a proposal for the Toyako G8 summit. And they identified this global action on health systems as what they called a new phase in global health policy. And this work, of course, for Toyako came after the Okinawa Infectious Disease Initiative at the G8 summit in 2000. And then the question comes, where should Japan go next? Two very successful global leadership initiatives in health. Well, this is the subject of paper 5. And there are several options that Japan could consider. Some countries have developed international policies on health as part of their foreign policy, explicitly so. Norway has perhaps led in this area beyond many other countries. The investments Norway has made in MDGs 4 and 5 and the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization has been a tremendous achievement led by its Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, and now Foreign Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre. Right at the centre of government policy sits health. Very unusual, very good. The United States put PEPFAR as a central plank of its international initiatives. Other countries have made health an important but separate part of their development policy. The country I come from, the United Kingdom, has done that with its Department for International Development. Still other countries have focused on the Millennium Development Goals or parts of those, while others are looking ahead beyond 2015, the MDG target date, thinking about, for example, non-communicable diseases. There is no better person than to take us through this maze of opportunity and challenge than our presenter, Professor Kenji Shibuya, who you have already heard from. So Kenji, wake us up. The floor is yours.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everybody. I think the fun part starts right now. When we have a conference like this, there's a tendency. There are so many people who attend the discussion on domestic health policy issues, as we did, in the last session. But when it shifts to global issues, the folks just leave the room. But this is quite exceptional. This time, people stay until the last minute, which is a good sign. So, actually, this is probably the biggest misfortune for Japan. We have expertise and experiences within Japan, but they are underutilized in global health arena. That is the central theme that I have been asked to speak on today. So, as Richard mentioned at the beginning of the conference, I think there is a huge potential and expectation that Japan should play a bigger role. And I will talk about 3 major reasons why Japan should do so. One is we are living in an interdependent world. Second, Japan is a biggest advocate of human security. And third, Japan is a mirror of our future. So let's start from the first one, an interdependent and interconnected world. So we had the Pakistan flood last year. You remember this photo of a sovereign lady last year. And this year, this is a very famous picture shown on a bunch of magazines and TV by the Asahi Shimbun. So disasters like the tsunami can happen anywhere in this interconnected world. And we must be ready to help, simply. All nations are experiencing feelings of uncertainty about health, about aging, about national debt, about terrorism, or about these disasters. In this interconnected and interdependent world, the concept of global health has become much more relevant. So global health cannot simply be viewed as a resource transfer from rich countries to poor countries, as was done in the 1990s. Instead, I think we can define global health as issues that directly or indirectly affect health, but can transcend national boundaries. So global health now needs real mutual partnership and a pooling of experience and knowledge and a two-way flow between developed and developing nations. So if we are to successfully progress toward universal coverage, for example, which is a major theme of global health community today, this will require what Leo Frank calls a process of shared learning among countries, whereby countries work together to establish best processes for achieving the goal. This Lancet actually aims to start this crucial effort through the lens of Japan. And this was exactly what I really wanted when I came back here in 2008, to achieve something by utilizing my friends and colleagues, including Lancet, so that we can show Japan has a potential, and Japan should play a major role in global health arena in this interdependent world. So as an academic, because I am a specialist in global health, of course, I advocate global health. But what do the Japanese people think about global health? If you look at this result of public opinion poll, so the question is, to which sector in development assistance should Japan give priority? Right? So surprisingly, more than 70% of the Japanese public rated health as the most important priority for Japanese foreign assistance. Health has been, of course, a major policy agenda, as we had a very heated, lively discussion in the previous session. But ordinary Japanese people think health should be the priority for foreign assistance. But the government of Japan only spent 2% of the total ODA on health, which is very small when compared to the OECD average of 50%. So there is a substantial gap between the Japanese public's foreign policy priorities and how Japanese foreign assistance is allocated in reality. So there is a very stereotypical argument that health aid cannot make money. But we should recall that health sector accounts for 10% of global GDP. And its share is increasing. We have a moral imperative to save lives and promote healthy life expectancy, but we can be pragmatic enough to promote health diplomacy, building upon Japanese comparative advantages such as technology and the system of good health at low cost with equity. If you recall, the country, Japan, has received much sympathy from around the world following the recent disaster in Tohoku. So this generosity, together with innovations and new public movements, particularly among the younger generation here, I think will make it much easier to gain support for global health among the Japanese people. To summarize, we are living in an interconnected and interdependent world, and health is probably the most concrete and useful example. Second, human security. This term has been repeated throughout the day. And I believe that Japan can argue that human security must be a key value for reforming the health system, both domestically and globally. Surya Anand, sitting next to me, who was my PhD advisor at Harvard, who is an excellent, eminent, prominent economist, I think according to him, security is protection against risks, right? No? Human security is protection of individual against certain types of risks, in a sense. So the concept of human security matches very well, according to Surya, with the concept of universal insurance coverage. You can correct me later. Japan made human security as a cornerstone of its foreign policy because I think Japan understands the interdependence of political, economic, and social development. In the health sector, there are many issues that cannot be simply treated within the traditional concept of state security. As a policy watcher, I am sometimes very critical of the government's global health policy. You know that. But I am very proud of the foreign ministry, which puts human security at the heart of its mission. So I'm very, very proud of their activities. So this is, again, I'd like to go back to the village where I provide free health checkup every weekend, Itade village. So these are people who don't know anything about their future. This is exactly the human security issue. So human security defined as to protect all human lives from critical and pervasive threats and give people the building blocks of survival, livelihood, and dignity, I think such as universal insurance coverage, is more relevant than ever to meet the challenges facing Japan, as exemplified in this case. Toward this end, I think we believe that Japan needs to apply this idea more proactively to its domestic and global health policy. And I think Japan is in the best position to persuade the countries to promote this concept of human security and its application in global health policy making, building upon its foreign policy and the history and experiences of universal health coverage. That's number 2. Finally, Japan is a mirror of our future. Actually, this is the word of Richard. Richard wrote a year ago in the Lancet, I quote, "The success of Japan's health system matters not only because of its importance to Japanese citizens, but also because Japan is a barometer of the health of the world." I think this is one of the key messages out of this Lancet Japan series. Japan's health expertise in achieving some of the world's best health outcomes and universal coverage is really underutilized in tracking global health challenges. Thus far, I think the series in the Lancet and discussion today have showcased the wealth of knowledge and expertise on health that Japan has accumulated over 50 years in its own quest to improve the health and well-being of its people. As shown in our first paper, Japan has shown that, for example, being poor cannot be an excuse for bad health. Strong government action in countries with relatively low national income per capita in a comparatively educated population can result in the implementation of very effective infectious disease control. So that's we have shown. And also it is possible to achieve good health at low cost. And finally, as Professor Ikeyama nicely articulated in his paper, the health system is very dynamic and needs adjustment over time. So the global health community, which is striving to achieve universal health insurance coverage, they have to understand that universal coverage is not the end. It is the beginning of new challenges, including cost escalation and greater demand for quality and efficiency. So these experiences and expertise are highly relevant in the era of scaling up interventions to achieve the health-related MDGs by 2015. And Japan's experience and knowledge on health insurance and long-term care will also be a huge asset in the post-MDG movement. As a citizen of an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, Japan should be actively sharing these accumulated insights with the international community and using them to strengthen national health around the world in the pursuit of progress in global health. Let me conclude this with some of the few ideas how to tackle Japan's untapped potential. So I spoke with Richard on our way back from the restaurant last night. We talked about the strategies implemented by, for example, the United Kingdom, Norway, or Thailand. Why they are so smart? Why they are so good at diplomacy? Why they are good at setting agenda? Although these successes by these countries in global health have been well recognized, and Japan has been under-recognized because Japan has traditionally adopted a relatively low profile. In our paper, our analysis suggests that Japan has not yet achieved its full potential to affect global health. To Japan's credit, we have in many instances shown substantial leadership in global health initiatives, such as in the eradication of smallpox in the 1980s. Isao Arita was responsible for overseeing the WHO's effort to eradicate smallpox in the last minute. And Shigeru Omi, who just spoke out about his idea on human resources, he spearheaded efforts to eliminate polio while he was the regional director of the Western Pacific Regional Office of WHO. And now Japan is stepping up its effort to eradicate polio from the globe. In fact, Japan has signed an agreement on an innovative loan conversion scheme in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to finance polio vaccines in Pakistan. So Japan could do relatively quite new and innovative things once officials are committed and united. Similarly, Arata Kochi, who was a little bit controversial figure in the global health arena, a Japanese public health physician, directed the WHO's TB program for 10 years, and he was instrumental in promoting DOTS. There are few exceptional leaders from Japan as well. And also, if you recall, at the intergovernmental level, the Japanese government has also successfully raised the issue of global health as a major policy agenda in two of the recent GS summits, including Kyushu Okinawa and Hokkaido Toyako. Thanks to the leadership of Professor Takemi, by employing a participatory process of multiple stakeholders, the government of Japan was able to effectively facilitate the development of strategic public-private partnerships, such as the Global Fund. So this approach made it possible to reach out high-level policymakers and bureaucrats and put the strengthening of health system high on the G8 agenda. So Japan can play an important role in developing countries, but we need strategies. We need means to achieve that. So when I came back, I called Kochi because sometimes he has a very good insight. He told me 4 things for Japan to set a global agenda or initiate global health initiatives, building upon his experience of DOT strategies. First, set agenda, very concrete agenda. So, for example, in his case, he used the slogan, TB is global emergency. When he took the job of the director of the global TB program, he set the agenda. Secondly, he said, we have to use science and evidence to convince medical community, notably the Lancet. He used the Lancet and asked Chris Marriott to write the cost effectiveness of DOTS program in 3 countries in 1994. Thirdly, he said, we don't need so many people, but bring in the best available people and let them do on-the-job training. By doing so, you can bring in the new talent and let them exposed to new ideas, and then they will be professional. And in fact, if you go to Geneva, lots of G2 directors, ADGs, quite a few of them are actually hired by Kochi. Finally, politics and money. Yes, that's very important. But these four things, if we carefully strategize, I think Japan could do something better. And this is exactly I tried to do, replicate, when I was asked to, take a lead on this Lancet series. So we published in the Lancet. So we set agenda, universal coverage at 50 years, and we published in the Lancet. So next step will be people, politics, and money. So that's what I have right now in terms of how to bring this agenda to the next level and how we can strategize the Japanese expertise and experiences. So finally, again, I'd like to quote what Richard wrote a year ago, which is still I like this phrase. I will quote, "Japan has enormous soft power. The country now seeks to marshal its considerable resources to claim its rightful place globally, as well as to improve its policy making domestically." I think that really set the tone for this Lancet Japan series. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kochi. Well, that must have been a very late telephone call last night then, as we came back from an evening with Keizo and others. Now, we have three commentators who are going to give their very individual perspectives. We have two from international multilateral institutions, but our first is a very unusual figure. In his biography in the booklet, he describes himself as a microeconomist. But that's just his part-time job. His real role is as an inspirer for the rest of us. He is the only philosopher of global health that we have in the world today. And it's my great privilege to introduce Professor Sudhir Anand from Oxford and Harvard Universities. Sudhir.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm not sure it's accurate. My brief was to comment on papers 5 and 6 and to trace the global implications of these papers. Now, I've read the papers. I've read, in fact, all the papers, and they're an excellent set, as everybody else has said so, too. So it becomes a little difficult to find scope for commentary in these papers. But some themes have been thrown up in these papers as a whole, and I'm going to pick on two of those themes, one of which certainly relates to paper 6, the paper by Kenji Shibuya and colleagues, one of the themes of which is good health at low cost. I'm afraid I will not have time to discuss universal healthcare coverage based on human security. I did try to write a little comment on that subject, and it's included in this series. Now, the last paper, which is number 6 in the series, is concerned with the future of Japan's system of good health at low cost. It defines universal health coverage as access for all to appropriate health services at an affordable cost. Of course, the question is, low or affordable cost to whom? Okay. The authors seem to mean cost to individuals and mention that the principle of financial risk protection ensures that the cost of care does not put people at risk of financial catastrophe. So it's cost to the people concerned. They do mean individuals. That's, of course, fine. But in comparing the cost of healthcare across countries, as paper 3, for example, does in this series, a different notion of cost is invoked. That paper states that Japan has achieved one of the highest life expectancies at birth of any country in the world, but it only spends 8.5% of the nation's GDP on health, half as much as the USA does, and its ranking, Japan's ranking in terms of total expenditure on health as a percentage of GDP is 20th among OECD countries. This concept of cost relative to national income leads to a simple fraction or percentage for each country, the share of health spending in national income, thereby making the cost of healthcare easily comparable across countries. The question is it the right notion to compare cost in relation to outcomes such as life expectancy or even the quality of care across countries? I don't believe so. This relative concept of cost gives little indication of the absolute volume of services provided in terms of drugs, diagnostic and surgical equipment, health professionals and health infrastructure, and so on. Thus, for example, Rwanda or Ghana may spend 20% of its gross national product on health, but that would not buy the goods and services, i.e. the health inputs, that a country which spends only 5% of its gross national product on health, but is 10 times richer. In my opinion, we do need an absolute measure of cost or spending to compare absolute achievements in health across nations. Absolute achievements such as life expectancy at birth of the population or the quality of care. Now, what is sometimes done in this regard is to use absolute health spending per capita in a country converted into US dollars at market or official exchange rates. But that conversion, as we all know, does not reflect the domestic prices of non-traded goods, such as the salaries of health workers practicing in different countries. Hence, we need to use exchange rates that do reflect the cost of a given basket of healthcare inputs in different countries. These would be called purchasing power parity or PPP exchange rates for health goods and services. Now, the World Bank, my colleagues to the right may correct me, through their International Comparison Program, ICP, does generate and is the repository of PPP data. But these are usually calculated to adjust gross domestic product or gross national income, not to calculate the relative costs of a fixed basket of health goods and services. The PPP exchange rates estimated to adjust GDP may not be appropriate to measure health sector spending because the basket of all goods produced in a country, i.e. GDP, is very different from the basket of health goods and services. I note that in the interesting paper, in fact, all the papers are interesting, but the interesting paper on aging in the series, paper number 4, the authors of that paper do compare long-term care spending per person in Japan, Germany, and the United States using PPP-adjusted exchange rates. But it's not clear whether they use health sector PPPs or the standard GDP PPPs. That was one comment. Now I would like to make a proposal, actually, to relating, again, to good health at low cost, which is, as I said, part of the title of Kenji's and others' paper number 6. The second issue that I want to raise in comparing health spending across countries, putting to one side the PPP question, is the following. Typically, total health spending in a country is adjusted by the number of people in that country to give health spending per capita, which is then compared across countries. Why do we do that? Well, the idea, more or less, is that if country A has twice the number of people as country B, it needs twice as much health spending, ceteris paribus, to achieve the same healthcare utilization for its population. Whereas dividing health expenditure by the number of people in a country takes account of its population size, it does not take account of its age composition. In particular, the per capita adjustment or correction assumes that the healthcare needs of the elderly are the same as those of the young. An 80-year-old needs the same healthcare as a 20-year-old or a 45-year-old. That's obviously not the case, as several papers in this series note. In comparing health spending across countries, we should take account of the age composition of the population, in addition to the size of the population. One way of doing so is to construct an equivalence scale that adjusts for the age composition of a population in terms of its needs for healthcare. Thus, for example, an 80-year-old may need 50% more healthcare than a 45-year-old, and a 20-year-old may need only 25% of the healthcare compared to the 45-year-old. Suppose we decide to normalize healthcare needs relative to those of the 45-year-old. Say, Kenji Shibuya is the numeraire of our calculation. It's as though in this population of one 80-year-old, one 45-year-old, and one 20-year-old, with the healthcare needs as I described them, 50% higher for the 80-year-old compared to the 45-year-old, and only 0.25 for the 20-year-old compared to the 45-year-old. It's as though then we have the equivalent of 1.5 Shibuyas corresponding to our 80-year-old person, 1 Shibuya corresponding to our 45-year-old person, and the equivalent of 0.25 Shibuyas corresponding to our 20-year-old person. In other words, this 3-member population has the equivalent of 2.75 Shibuyas or 45-year-olds. Okay? Of course, I realize that Kenji Shibuya is totally unique, so the idea of having equivalent Shibuyas is a little difficult for us to accept. A 3-member population consisting now entirely of 20-year-olds has the equivalent of 0.75 Shibuyas, and a 3-member population, all of whom are 80-year-old, is the equivalent of 4.5 Shibuyas in terms of their healthcare needs. We should, in my opinion, be deflating total health spending in a country by the number of equivalent Shibuyas, or equivalent 45-year-olds. That would give a more accurate picture of health spending relative to the needs of a country than just deflating spending by the number of people and ignoring their differential healthcare needs. Now, how does this relate to comparing health spending across countries? Well, if such an adjustment were to be carried out for the age composition in each country, using the same equivalent scale for each country, it would become quickly clear, I believe, that because of the much higher proportion of elderly people in Japan compared to other countries, the number of equivalent 45-year-olds per capita or per person in Japan will be much higher than it is in other countries. In other words, the difference between health spending per capita and health spending per Shibuya will be much greater in Japan than elsewhere. So using the absolute measure of health spending per capita across countries will give an indication of resources expended relative to needs that is more biased in the case of Japan than it is in the case of other countries. The larger adjustment in Japan for the needs of a population which is weighted more towards the elderly is likely to show, in fact, I think, that Japan's achievement of good health at low cost is even more impressive. Japan would have attained a higher life expectancy despite spending less per equivalent 45-year-old because it has more equivalent 45-year-olds than other countries. This method, incidentally, that I'm proposing is a little similar to what economists do in constructing equivalent scales for households to take account of their size, not just their size, but the size and age-sex composition in adjusting household income for needs to make household welfare comparisons or, for example, to calculate household income inequality in a country. So, in my opinion, some such adjustment is necessary to health spending in a country to account for the differential healthcare needs of different age compositions of populations. An appropriate international comparison of good health at low cost requires an estimation of the number of Shibuya equivalents in each country and dividing total cost of spending by the country's number of Shibuyas based on the number of persons in each age group. I believe that cost per Shibuya is then a more appropriate measure to compare spending across countries than cost per capita. Thank you.
Well, you were all here when a new international standard was born, the Shibuya. So, congratulations, Kenji. Your name is now written into history. Our second commentator is also an economist, Joseph Kutzin. And Joseph works with the World Health Organization. And another document that is a gripping read was the recent WHO report on health systems financing, a path to, you guessed it, universal coverage. And for those of us who've been hanging around meetings like this for a few years, I think the lineage of this report very much came out of the work of Keizo and others in the run-up to the G8 summit a few years ago at Toyoko, where these three pillars of financing, health information, and human resources for health became the central kind of axis for thinking about this new era of health systems. So, Joseph, please.
Thanks very much, Richard. And just also wanted to thank you and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. It's really a privilege to be sharing the table here with the colleagues that are around it. I was asked to reflect on the proposals around Japan's role in global health from the perspective of WHO. And to do that, I wanted to maybe organize this in a few steps. I don't really have the mandate to speak on behalf of WHO, but I will give my reflections and my interpretation of what that means, having worked in the organization now and survived for more than 17 years in headquarters at country level in Central Asia and as a regional advisor in the European region.
I didn't survive.
I don't know what the equivalent, if there's an equivalent index or term for this as well. Right. But in particular, and based also related to what Richard just said, to really relate this as well to our agenda for following up on the World Health Report 2010 on universal coverage. And I think, some ideas that came out of reading these papers about how to engage much better, more strategically, and simply more with the expertise that exists in Japan. And thus really also bringing out some of the key messages on universal health coverage that come out of the Japanese experience, also in light of what's happening in other countries in the region and around the world. And I was first going to say in low and middle income countries in other regions and around the world, but clearly this is not just relevant for low and middle income countries, but is something more global, if you will. And there is, I think, a lot of relevance of this experience for countries at all income levels. And then finally, just to close, because as some of you may know, WHO itself is in some financial difficulty, and there's a lot of internal discussion and programs going on now to refocus the organization. And so maybe some reflections, again, maybe more personal than official, on what you can do for us to make this a better and more functional organization.
It's okay, we won't tell Dr. Chan what you're about to say.
No, that's, well, we'll see. She doesn't know who I am yet, so that's okay. I've just landed in Geneva. Related to this agenda, though, I just wanted to say some words of thanks about the whole series, but in particular the paper, as you might guess, of interest to me on universal health coverage in Japan and the historical perspective and as well as the technical analysis really was one of the best papers I've read on health financing and universal coverage in quite a long time, and I have read a lot of them. It goes well beyond the labels of the system, which I think is very important, gets into the nuance and the details, and captures this in a quite concise way. Clearly, it was something that I picked up that there's a lot of relevance to what could be happening and what is happening in other countries. And this idea, again, of shared learning between countries is very important, especially, and I'm thinking more recently in the last 8 years when I've been working as the advisor for the European region, of just how to deal with a situation when you have systems that are grounded in certain core values that are now challenged by very severe fiscal constraints. So this, I think, is a very important experience. And also that the paper put and this is very much a bias, but put the focus and the recommendations as well on the issue of fragmentation in financing arrangements. And in a study that we recently completed on health financing reforms in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union countries, this was the key message. How did they address fragmentation, consolidate their funding arrangements? And you recall the discussion that was just had previously about consolidation at the prefectural level, at the national level, and so on. This is very current in reform discussions today. And of course, in writing that paper, I knew nothing, and many of the authors, I think, really knew nothing of what was happening in Japan. We missed out the opportunity to benefit from that experience, but hopefully not anymore. One of the critical things as well in that, and it'll relate to what I'll say about our future plans in universal coverage, but it's very important, is that historically there has been a lot of what I might call inappropriate export of one country's reform agenda to another. And this has happened very much in the health financing literature, health financing experience. And why, again, this paper, I think, offers a cautionary tale, and especially how it ended. This has come up very much, for example, with the reform that's typically labeled social health insurance and its introduction into developing countries where a relatively small percentage of the population is working in the formal sector. There is a real issue, I think, in understanding the history where insurance initially developing as a right of labor, an attachment to labor with a certain objective of keeping the labor force healthy. And then the implications of a shift, and again, as brought out in the paper, when it becomes a human right or a right of citizenship, the agenda, the objectives change. The role of general revenue funding is very strong then in thinking about that transition, and especially in a context where most of the population is not in the formal sector. So this is an important issue. There was a paper in the Lancet not so long ago, a few contributions on universal coverage, and one, I think, by Dave Gwatkin and a colleague, argued very well that, yes, universal coverage, but the path chosen matters a lot. And it's possible that the paths taken by some countries may actually make it much more difficult because of some of the things actually brought out in this paper in Japan, that the political interest may line up against it if the system becomes fragmented too quickly. So it's just something that I found very useful and important for my work, and I'm hoping to harness this more as we move forward with this in WHO. In terms of the proposals, one is very easy to comment on, and I'll do it briefly, which is unusual for me. But just to say, yes, Japan can and should increase its financial commitment to international health development, of course, and I think the case is very well made. It was interesting, one of the obstacles that was noted to this happening and to having a more coherent policy was in part related to a fragmentation that exists in part within the government, in part in wider society, between the domestic health policy agenda and those active in global or international health. I would only say this is not just a Japanese situation. This is something we see, certainly we see it in Europe, where you don't often have a lot of communication between the health ministry and the development ministry. So in the regional committee for Europe, for example, we don't see the development agencies that are actually providing funding assistance to those parts of the region, say in Central Asia, which are receiving that. So this is something. At the same time, there are some good examples, and Richard mentioned Norway, and that's one where we've seen very strong evidence of actual discussion, dialogue, some joint planning between the health and development ministries. So that could be something that's quite useful to learn from for Japan. What came across very clearly, though, in this, and as somebody who entered this not knowing much at all about the Japanese health system, was that there is here an incredibly valuable but largely untapped experience to share with countries all over the world about how to achieve good health in low cost, how to balance and manage a struggle between the core values that are stated and the opportunities to deal with that in the context of harsh fiscal constraints. And thus, certainly, there is considerable scope for Japan to develop its global and regional health leadership capacity on a range of topics, including my favorite one of health financing for universal coverage. Now, beyond this, and I think others have mentioned this in the course of discussions, this is also an excellent time. And it's not just because of our report, but many more things are happening in this area. Certainly in Asia, we've heard about, and that we know countries in the region have taken concrete steps to move towards universal coverage. We have the example of Thailand that was cited South Korea as well, doing this long ago and making progressive steps since that time. I would add that if we expand Asia to include Central Asia, which is still geographically in Asia, although not according to the way that WHO and the World Bank understand geography, I guess is true, then a low-income country there, Kyrgyzstan, has also taken significant steps over a decade to fundamentally reform its health financing system, address fragmentation, and so on. We also know that there are the very large countries, China and India, have announced and have started to implement some major initiatives oriented to this. And many other countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Tajikistan, again in Central Asia, are really debating and trying to develop their plans to do this. Similarly, elsewhere in the world, we have this. In Africa, there are very good examples in process now in Ghana, in Rwanda. South Africa just came out with a green paper, a proposal for development of national health insurance. In Central Europe, there's been very extensive reforms in a lot of the formerly socialist countries of Central Europe. We have very good experiences from Moldova, from Estonia, the Czech Republic, which has done a lot with reforms to its risk adjustment system that might be relevant here. And also, Western European countries are very much struggling with a lot of these issues and how to balance their commitment to solidarity with these constraints. And I think the point was made about the mirror issue, and certainly Japan could be a mirror for Western European countries, but it's not playing into the discussion so much. So this dialogue, this paper, this series could be very valuable in that regard. And then, of course, there is my own country, which, if you can guess from my accent, is the United States. And one of the things that came across most clearly to me in this discussion is, and the papers, was that one of the things that the experience of Japan shows, and I think as well in a lot of Western Europe, is that while there are debates about the instruments and how to move, there is initially some sort of fundamental consensus on underlying values and objectives that are meant to be achieved. That still seems to be absent in the U.S., and without that, it's hard to see how one would really move forward. So this is a very important contribution. Just some specific reflections from WHO perspective.
Very briefly, Joe.
Okay. It's very timely because we're introducing now an action plan for universal coverage grounded in a World Health Assembly resolution. And Japanese experience could really contribute greatly to that process. Just finally, in the paper that Richard mentioned from 2 years ago saying about the global health systems agenda, there was said that it's important and imperative for WHO to really strengthen and clarify its core functions and improve its technical and organizational competencies. This, I think, holds true today, and again, the extent to which the institution, the Secretariat, can do that is limited. It really depends on the influence of the member states. And having an intensified engagement push from Japan, from other member states, to really say, we need WHO to be different. We need you to really focus and engage in those key policy issues is very important. It can work very well, and we had very good experience jointly with Armin and the European region of WHO World Bank collaboration to really promote health reform. So I just want to thank you again. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity and really looking forward to future collaboration with Japanese experts. Thank you.
Front page news. WHO calls on the Japanese government to invest more in development assistance for health. Thank you. Our third commentator is Armin Fiedler, known to many of you as the lead advisor for health policy and strategy for the World Bank's Human Development Network. Armin's worked for WHO and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the US before, and he's also been involved in a multiplicity of global health initiatives and partnerships. Armin, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Richard. When I joined the World Bank, I guess it's now 18 years ago, my first boss told me to go to Mexico and to engage the government explicitly only on primary care, and he was very strict on that. I was not supposed to talk about anything else. Needless to say that I defied the orders and had a very good conversation with Michael's new boss, Julio Frank at the time, about the whole gamut of what health means for this country. The reason why I'm telling this story is because we have evolved tremendously over these last 2 decades in our dialogue on global health. And I think for me, these Lancet series, these Lancet papers, in a sense, all hang together and provide a tremendous learning opportunity for us as we engage countries in what is global health, what is health systems reform, what is universal coverage. If you think about the bank, did very simplistic things for perhaps way too long, simply investment in infrastructure, primary care infrastructure, etc. It was really the 1993 WDR, the World Development Report, which kind of pushed the bank much closer to the notion of health being an integral part of economic development, and henceforth a very important ingredient of human security, the Japanese notion and cornerstone of Japanese foreign policy. That was kind of a first step. Now, fast forward 20 years, we are now very happy to engage with our Japanese counterparts in a joint research program that will further elaborate based on the Japanese experience, making these lessons relevant for them, for us, and hopefully as we engage globally for our clients around the world, and we're extremely thankful for that. And this is a very important step in our partnership. Now, if we talk about global health and many of the experiences which are illustrated in this Lancet series, you can see that many of these concepts mean different things to different people. As, for example, also universal coverage means different things to different people in different countries. There are dangers in this dialogue, and I think, again, the Lancet series allows us to educate the debate a bit. For example, we shouldn't get stuck in pure advocacy. I mean, we need to focus on evidence-based engagement. We face the drama of many times not having enough data to really ground our engagement in evidence. And that's one of the challenges that we have and that we have to overcome. Within global health, I believe, and some other speakers alluded to that, we need to transcend the sometimes very focused, single-minded agendas of single disease focus, or even just, picking out 1 or 2 MDGs that we are kind of the pet peeve of someone in a specific country. And again, I think the debate here and the experience of Japan has shown how to do it. These are long-term goals. It requires a lot of ingredients in order to align society, to prepare society for a true transformation, and in the end, a health system which really delivers on health outcomes. Perhaps in this context, as my second point, it's important also to learn from history. And I also liked this series so much because it illustrated and reconfirmed some of the learnings from elsewhere. Very much so what we know from social insurance history in many European countries. It is not usually kind of a technocratic decision by one enlightened person who then mandates a certain health environment. It is a very messy political economy process that many times goes over many decades, and I think that the Japanese experience is very illustrative to that. The increasing demand for role of government as countries become more affluent. This is something that we see around the world. The notion of social solidarity and building on early experiences of social solidarity in individual communities. From my own country in Austria, we had this for over 120 years, that municipalities had social solidarity communities where people paid in something in order to have a safety net when they got sick. And then, in a sense, the social security concept was built upon that. Very similar that I found, based on the Lancet series description, the history of Japan. The demand for social peace and social solidarity as a means to achieve that. And in the end, also, the historic factor that many times these health systems became really an impetus in the context of economic growth. And last but not least, in this historic context, once you have achieved the coverage, as the series also describes, you can't stop. Then the notions of cost effectiveness, quality, equity of access become very prominent in the debate. I was very glad that even previous speakers pointed out the issue of a value debate. I will never forget them, and I will not mention the country, but I was in my Europe and Central Asia days. I was going to a country and I was talking about perhaps a solidaric health financing arrangement. I said, we don't want solidarity. We had 50 years of communism. Now we want to have competition and individual risk rating, etc. So, I mean, if a society is not prepared for these type of social contract, if you will, then, you know, whatever technical concept that you try to introduce will probably not take root. I also still, from my graduate school days, I hear ringing in my ears Bill Shaw's words that health is an uninsurable risk. And again, I mean, some of you, Professor Ikegami, I believe he has re-emphasized this. I mean, there is a certain role, of course, of the private sector, but of course, we need to understand that this is a different concept than a social solidarity concept. Perhaps you could even argue it's erroneously called social insurance in that context. We also learned that from the experience in Japan. Something which was also addressed, I believe, Dean Feinberg was it, who was concerned about the boundaries. We cannot only talk about health services or the health system. There's so many other determinants which play into good health outcomes. And I think it would be erroneous to forget about those. Particularly also when, for a government, as we allocate resources, I mean, should you spend more on education when we know educational attainment, particularly of women in international health, perhaps contributes more to health outcomes than many of our health interventions within our own health systems. What about poverty? Much of the research that we do as an institution, poverty and the intergenerational dimension of poverty, how much does that contribute to ill health? And shouldn't we address this, certainly in parallel, but perhaps even more than investment in health? And again, the debate in Japan and the learning from Japan is so important. How were these things, these kind of multi-sectorial determinants of good health outcomes addressed? It's very important that I see this learning coming out from the Lancet series. My final point, we talk about health in a crisis, an external crisis, and how all at once it stimulates a debate about health. It's also very interesting from some of the research that we have been doing, looking at the financial crisis and looking at the resilience of health systems vis-à-vis the financial crisis. And obviously not all is good. We saw that in many social security systems, as revenues fell because of the crisis, because tax revenue fell, immediately that was passed on and health expenditures were reduced. Even during recoveries are fragile in any case, but we understand that social expenditures are even behind this kind of fragile recovery in many states. So we do need to, when we design systems, we need to also make sure that we have resilient systems that pass these type of stress tests, such as what happened in Japan, such as a global economic crisis. Something else that we discovered, which is also pointed out in a number of the papers, is the need for data. Many times we are just really shooting in the dark. There is a true scarcity of data to make data-driven, evidence-based decisions in this context. And I think the Lancet series also could be a call for recognizing this and providing a more data-driven, analytical, and evidence-based recommendation as systems reform. So, in summary, I would say, first, for us, my first point, this year is very important for our collaboration with Japan in the interest of global health. I'm taking great expectation in our joint research program, which we are initiating now. And of course, the learning that comes out of the Japanese system is of great value for us, as we, not only for middle-income countries, but increasingly also for low-income countries. My second point, to harmonize the debate about human security, or in World Bank parlance, it would be social protection in a sense. And health for us is very much part of that kind of social safety net, the social protection. In that sense also, it dovetails with the philosophical notion of human security that comes from Japan. We really want to promote a systems thinking, and we are very concerned about a turn in international and global health that many times, because there is a lot of political pressure to deliver immediate results, immediate measurable results, lives saved, etc., that might in fact backstab systems development, the development of a sustainable health system that in the end delivers good health outcomes for the population.
Okay, Armin, how are we doing?
I'm almost done. I mentioned already the issue of the data in our country dialogue, the need to engage also based on values and culture, and not only on some technocratic models. And finally, to learn from these type of stress tests, these external events, be it economic crisis or being crisis that Japan faces now, and see them also as opportunities. So we wouldn't be here, perhaps, if not for this type of stress test that Japan has experienced, and hopefully something positive will come out of this engagement. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Now we have some time for questions, and the questions should be very much focused on where does Japan go next. So we want as many as possible, brief, and when you say your point, if you could say who you are and where you're from. Pop your hands up and let's have a look. Who'd like to go first? Yes, please. Yes.
Please.
So?
Yeah.
Yes.
Since last year I joined JICA, 10 years ago, I was with the World Bank, same as Dr. Fiedler, and I was with the European and Central Asia Bureau, and I was the Director General of the Central Asia Bureau and covered 5 Central Asian nations and all the programs of the 5 Central Asian nations. First of all, in this Lancet Japan series, global implication is talked about in all chapters, but the experience in Japan should be tapped upon for use in developing nations. What lessons could be learned? What failures have we experienced? I think more additional homework needs to be done beyond this Japan series. But one important point is when the national health insurance system was established, the first focus was self-employed and farmers, because if they are left untouched, they were called as informal sectors. No tax revenue came from these sources, and they could have become causes of inequality, but they were engaged in the formal economy, and I think that would be a lesson for universal insurance system to be introduced in various systems, and it could be an implication as countries try to establish tax systems, and therefore this needs to be further studied in various perspectives. Secondly, this is more of a comment rather than a question. We have to scale up our aid in the health sector, and that's possible. I was quite surprised after joining JICA. Health and education is not an area for the grants or loans. They don't inject energy at the cost of lending. And the conditionality of JICA is 0.75% interest rate, not 10 years, but 40 years, payback in 40 years. This is the concessional loan, which is more or less like a grant. And huge amount of such financing or grants can be offered. But what do you do with regards to so much money being injected? Polio, Pakistan, campaigners, experiment cost, and the cost of activities, and polio vaccination purchase. These were the purpose for which the funds were used. On top of that, system improvement is another area where we wish to invest. This is, if a politically difficult system is to be improved, we want to offer more lending.
A 4-minute question, which is great, but we're not going to get many questions if we have 4-minute questions. So I want us to keep the questions very short. no longer than a minute. Ravi Narayan.
My question is that I think we all have been talking about the Jap. Is it?
You're on. Push again.
Turn it on.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm just wondering whether this new decision or new consensus that seems to be building up, and I think it's very important to learn from the Japanese experience of universal health coverage and to partner with other countries and so on, should be linked somehow to the youth of Japan and not just to the resources that Japan has. But I think it's also from a country that young people could become ambassadors for this. So I'm just wondering as a question, how can we link this whole new idea of partnerships to giving young people in Japan the opportunity not just to see their country becoming a global leader in health, but to be part of that leadership?
Thank you. Yes, right there, Tim Evans, and then the gentleman in front of you.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Japan has considered, like other countries such as Great Britain, Norway, United States, and Switzerland, the development of a global health policy as a means of bridging some of the problems of fragmentation with respect to health and health development and its relations to health security.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, gentleman who was right in front of you on the end. Yes.
Hi, I'm Unni Krishnan from United Nations University. With my limited reading, I understand that one of the success in good health at low cost in Japan has been the appropriate integration of traditional knowledge and various other cultural practices into the healthcare system. And in the 6th chapter of Universal Health Coverage by Kenji Shibuya, he also mentioned the example of Kerala, the Rockefeller Foundation study, where it's also being increasingly cited that traditional knowledge has played a central role in building the health system. So what will be the perspective that Japan will have for developing countries to integrate traditional medicine or traditional knowledge into their healthcare system? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Down here and then immediately behind.
Kai Hong Pua from National University of Singapore. I want to go back to the question of what can Japan offer to the world in terms of its experience, whether it's historical, apart from its culture. For example, you are the most aged society. You are ahead of the curve. What is there in terms of learning? Not just showing us the positive side, but also the negative lessons to be avoided. Because unless you get the data which is comparable, it's very hard to compare. You know? What is cultural or contextual, and at what stage of history? I think that those have been done. So what Sudhir, for example, mentioned, the age-adjusted kind of consumption thing has to be comparable. And epidemiologists know all about this, but economists has to be educated, that you have to do all the risk adjustment. So managers who have looked at case mix, who have looked at DRG to adjust for all those different before it's truly comparable. So what are those real lessons unless we get the evidence?
Very good. Thanks. Yes, please.
Population Research Institute, Nishimura is my name. There is one thing which occurred to me. There was a JICA person who spoke before me, so may I offer a comment? And I'd like to solicit your views about that. Since early this morning, we've been discussing the Japanese universal coverage, which has augmented the health level of Japan. I can fully understand that, and that story could be implied to other countries. I fully understand that. But if you go one step forward, there are things which are not researched yet. And that is that when you become healthy, economy improves. Is that the case? That is not something so much researched in Japan. Overseas, internationally, yes, there are some researches about the connection between the two. So JICA person said, as he said, actually when it comes to economic growth and economic development, it doesn't produce necessarily a great rate of return, but at a certain level of sustainable economy can be created. I think this thinking is very important. So is there a possibility of making a research in this area? Does anybody have any view about that?
Okay, we're going to have to stop questions now, unfortunately, but I'm going to ask just Kenji to respond in 60 seconds to these excellent points that have been made.
I could be the metric or ambassador or whatever I could do, but I totally agree with you that we need to utilize the younger generation to be exposed, this opportunity to be exposed to the rest of the world. And also Tim's idea of development higher level committee on global health. I think we are working toward that end, and I think Keizo is taking a lead. So we would definitely try to do that kind of cross-cutting higher level development global health policy planning process. In terms of the impact, investing in health, whether it will lead to economic growth or not, I think Jeffrey Sachs did through his Commission on Macroeconomic and Health around 2000. So I think we can revisit and also use that evidence to convince JICA that you could use loan to promote health as well as economic growth. And I hear a good thing from the Vice President of JICA. JICA is ready to invest in health. So I'm very happy right now.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that session. Please give a round of applause for all of our speakers. We're in the home stretch. To begin concluding comments, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce a friend and colleague, Y.S. Chi, who is the chairman of the Reed Elsevier Management Committee. Now, what is the Reed Elsevier Management Committee? The only thing that you need to know is that Reed Elsevier is the publisher of the Lancet. So, very important to have this gentleman here. Not only is Y.S. in that very senior management position within Reed Elsevier, but he's also an internationalist first and foremost. And I know that because he spends more days travelling than the Director General of WHO. But his main task is to internationalise the perspectives and views of publishing within this large science and technical division and broader across Reed Elsevier. It's about globalization. It's about bringing knowledge from all parts of the world together in a common community. YS, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you. Is this on? This one? こんにちは。今回は
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in this important symposium.
I just want to add my thanks to everyone for joining us here today. But special thanks are due to Yamamoto Tadashi-san, JCIE, and of course my friend Richard, my friend Bill, and the Lancet for organizing this important and very timely event. I also want to thank all the speakers for sharing your thoughts on the current and future state of Japanese healthcare. Because healthcare is vital to happiness in our everyday lives, Elsevier remains committed to helping disseminate health science information to improve and even save lives all over the world. As the world leader in science and health information, we want to re-emphasize our commitment and support for the vibrant research community here in Japan and applaud the insightful ideas that have been and will continue to come from it. With the rise of technology-based social networks, I think that it is really even more important than ever that people come together at events like this in person to discuss the matters of public policy that shapes our world today. The quality of research presented and the substance of the comments and discussions demonstrate that the Lancet Special Series has been a success. There is inspiring insight to be gained by gathering together some of the world's brightest thinkers, researchers, and policymakers to tackle some of the country's most pressing public issues. This project has been in the works for more than 2 years, well before the March 11th disaster. And I believe that its importance was only reinforced by the events of this past spring. And I have been so impressed by the resilience of the Japanese people. I think that this speaks for the character of the citizens here as well as the strength of Japan's infrastructure. While I have learned from the Lancet Japanese series that Japan's system is not perfect, it is certainly better off because of the careful examination being done to the system. I have no doubt that the work done through the series will lead to the improvements in the quality of healthcare in Japan, even more so than it already is. Japan is dealing with the aftermath of global financial crisis, the March earthquake and tsunami, the resulting nuclear crisis, and on top of all this, a rapidly aging society. I look forward to seeing some of the findings from this symposium to be actually implemented to help solve the issues. My hope is that other countries will learn from these findings and perhaps take their own initiatives towards improving their healthcare systems. I would also like to say thank you to those of you who are representing the various entities and branches of the government of Japan for taking seriously the health and well-being of your citizens. Your support for endeavors like this Lancet special series on Japan is exemplary, and I hope personally that with your new Prime Minister, who will set out his roadmap for Japan soon, that the topic will be of the highest priority. Thank you all again for participating today, and to a strong and long-lasting relationship between Elsevier, the Lancet, the Japan Center for International Exchange, and the government and citizens of Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, YS. Our penultimate concluding remarks come from a very close colleague, Dr. Bill Summerskill, who has worked intensively, and that word doesn't even begin to do justice to how intensively Bill has worked with the authors of the Japan series. This has been a project that Bill has worked on with passion these past few years, and it's a great tribute to him and the team for the results. Bill.
Thank you, Richard. Today's symposium is a step on a journey which began for universal health care in Japan in 1961, and a journey that began for many of the people in this room in 2009. And on that journey, there has been a great deal of support from a number of people. The great and the good, as it were. The great we discussed this morning. We mentioned the funders, the Japan Center for International Exchange, the China Medical Board, the Gates Foundation. But I want to spare a moment to thank the good. Those people who really did work providing administrative and translation support to make this series a reality, particularly the staff of the Japan Center for International Exchange, and I'd like to name two of those, Tomoko Suzuki and Susan Hubbard. Today, our distinguished panelists have given voice to the words of the Japan series. Tomorrow, the challenge is to translate those words into action, both in Japan and internationally. Joe spoke a few moments ago about shared learning. In the remaining moments today, we need to concentrate on shared doing. Individuals are important. They're actually key in this process. Earlier today, we met Mrs. Sato, the 86-year-old woman living in the shadow of Fukushima. And we heard of her story and its importance. I would say to each person involved in this series that they have a responsibility to make sure that the best practice that has been documented is propagated, and equally to make sure where there is evidence of weakness that this is a focus on reform. The need for reform was reiterated today by Professors Shibuya, Reich, Feinberg, Watanabe, Ikegami. It has been a central theme of this issue. But to carry out reform requires allies at all levels. And therefore, it is very appropriate that we have heard today from a journalist, a parliamentarian, a governor, and a doctor's leader. And in the words of the president of the Japan Medical Association, Dr. Haranaka, wider engagement with other stakeholders is essential. Because the success of your hard work ultimately will be judged by clinical outcomes. And on that, I'd like to reiterate the editorial that begins the Japan series, that the Lancet is committed to follow and to comment on the progress made on the recommendations that are listed here. And I hope each of you will do the same. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, and it's my deep pleasure now to give the floor to our intellectual leader for this project, Keizo Takemi.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I don't know whether I'm an intellectual leader or not, but please allow me to this occasion using for a very, very personal things. This year, as you know, the 50th anniversary for our universal insurance system. But now, this 50th anniversary is not only for our universal insurance system, but personally, this is the 50th birthday of the Richard Horton. So, I, on behalf of the Japan Lancet team, of course he's a part of our team, but we would like to present this plate of the Lancet, but this is the Lancet for the celebration of the 50th year anniversary, Richard. And we printed on his name here and his birthday a bit later of this date, but I would like to give him this as a present for the 50th anniversary. But basically, this original idea comes from the Kenji Shibuya, and he has a lot of ideas. That's the reason why he became one of the chief leader of our editorial board. Thank you.
Last but not least, from early in the morning to this evening, thank you very much for your attendance. I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude for your attendance. In my original speech, initial speech, in raising various questions in Japan, in the 21st century, in the international society, especially we have a responsibility to share what we've experienced and communicate in a way that people can understand from abroad. And in the 21st century international community, we should take a larger role than before. By doing so, this is fulfilling the role as a leader, leading a mature state. So in the health insurance sector, health care sector, we had been conducting analysis to a certain extent, but this is not 100% complete or perfect. As was mentioned by Bill Summerskill, 21st century in this sector, this is just a first step of a long journey ahead. So the policy research in this area needs to be continued. We actually hope that many young researchers would be joining this effort. So to contribute to the policy discussions in the area of healthcare of Japan. So through the launch of the Lancet special series on Japan this time, that is our highest expectation. And through such efforts, when comparing with other countries, relatively speaking, we were able to establish a relatively healthy society, and the conditions that led to that, however, rapidly are eroding. So how are we going to address that in the future? How can we sustain the healthy society, the various mechanisms? How can it be rebuilt? So those are the major challenges faced, and we reconfirmed once again of those challenges by the launch of the Lancet special series on Japan. So going forward, the actual content of the reform needs to be communicated and discussed widely here with the citizens of Japan, seek understanding of the policymakers, and to translate that to implementation. As was mentioned by my friend Pomi Yang, the reform has to be brought and convinced by the citizens, and that should serve as a basis of implementation. We need to convince the citizens, consumers. And we hope that the Lancet special series on Japan will contribute to that, and we will continue our efforts to this end. But today, in Japan, there is unfortunately a political confusion. But on the other hand, that may serve as an opportunity, a rare opportunity to bring about drastic reform. So this major opportunity, how can we take advantage of that? I think it depends on our will. Our will and motivation has to be very strong to improve our healthcare system. So in that sense, in various senses, we hope that the Lancet special series on Japan will trigger new types of ideas, and in order to strengthen your strong resolve for healthcare reform, if we have served that purpose, I think there is a big significance of launching this special series. And fortunately, Bill, as Bill mentioned, there have been words of gratitude to the various people involved in launching this special series, which I will not repeat. But many people have been involved and contributed to the development of the special series. The private sector researchers and people involved in healthcare and the government sector and the media, and also across the borders. There have been various friends that participated in our team work. So whenever we engage and embark upon new frontiers, network needs to be organized, and it has to be linked with international networks in taking up these new challenges. In the 21st century, that it would be a must. So that comes from my direct experience. The Lancet special series on Japan has triggered this first step of the long journey in the 21st century. We hope to go step by step in a solid, firm manner. And last but not least, I would like to thank all of you for your contributions. Thank you very much once again to Richard.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a wonderful thing on very, very beautiful Japanese paper. Yeah, it is very good. This is the Kenji Zaiji. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
どうもありがとうございました。